Let's finish up this section here, and now we're going to move from Paul's boldness to Paul's militancy. Now Paul becomes more militant as we can see this crescendo is building. This thing is building up as Paul now has to prove that he is not a coward, he is a warrior. And he is prepared to deal with all of this warfare. Again, it bears repeating, he did not run from the problem, he ran to the problem to deal with the issue. Thus, Paul's rising intensity finally culminated in an all-out declaration of war, if you will. The leader's compassion doesn't cancel out his willingness to fight. Yes, I believe that you can be compassionate, okay, and you can be a warrior at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive, with neither one can cross each other's path. I want you to understand that. The leader's compassion doesn't cancel out his willingness to fight. In fact, his courage is equal to his passion. That has to be true. A leader needs to be courageous. We just have way too many coward-like behavior from too many pastors leading churches all over the world. Paul's enemies had accused him of acting, living out according to the flesh. That's the accusation. You remember this. And he did so in a very fleshly manner. Because in 2 Corinthians 10:2, I ask that when I am present, I need not be bold with the confidence with which I propose to be courageous against some. Now notice the end of this verse. Who regards us as if we walk according to the flesh, according to the world. This was the accusation. And Paul is not running from this. He's not going to run to it. He flatly and forcefully denied the accusation that he was morally corrupt. He was not going to have it. He goes, okay, I'm done now. He also threatened to display his boldness against anyone who impugned his character in that way. Paul was not going to allow. Let's be real clear about something here. You see, sometimes you're going to have to fight the fight. It's not just that the Lord defends you and you do nothing, because you understand what you're doing. The problem is that your sheep don't understand that. So they're going to need some leadership coming from you because let me tell you, ultimately the goal is not only to destroy you, but it is to go after the sheep. That's what the goal is. Nonetheless, in verse 3 of 2 Corinthians chapter 10, he acknowledged, Paul, that there was a true sense in which he walked in the flesh. And I know that sounds a little strange, but follow the thought pattern here for a moment. After all, he was mortal and he was made of human flesh. In other words, he was recognizing, yeah, I do walk according to the flesh. You know, I am a human being. I have my frailties. I have my weaknesses. It's when I'm weak is when Christ is strong. Hello? In 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 3, look at it. He says, for though we walk in the flesh, he says, we do not war according to the flesh. Paul never denied that. He was making a play on words. He still denied, of course, that he walked. He still denied, of course, that he walked according to the flesh. What he said was, look, there's a difference between saying, I walk in flesh, okay? Because I'm flesh, I walk in flesh, okay? There's a big difference between saying I walk in flesh and I walk according to the flesh. Do you see the difference? There's a big difference. And Paul played on those words because he had to just draw this simple analogy out, a simple picture for his people to be able to see it with great clarity. So he also admitted that Paul admitted he was still in the flesh. He did. In the human sense. Hey, I'm in the flesh. I'm not walking around here in the spirit. I'm in the flesh. Let me tell you something. When I go to lunch, trust me, I'm not eating in the spirit. I can guarantee you, I'm eating in the flesh. And in other words, he wasn't claiming, Paul wasn't trying to claim that he was some supernatural, super duper natural guy. No. He said, hey, I'm a regular Joe. I'm a regular human being just like anybody else. And yet, Paul was prepared to wage war. That's what he was prepared to do in the supernatural realm. Let's stay there. Look at this. I want you to see it in 2 Corinthians 10. No. Now let's look at verse 3, 4, and 5. Because this is how we get to these verses here. You know, you hear these verses, people are quoting them all the time, and usually they quote them out of context. And I'm trying to keep you inside the context of these verses. And he says this in verse 3. He says, for though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. And then he says in verse 4, for the weapons of our what? Our warfare are not of the flesh, but divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses. We are destroying speculations and every lofty thing, he says, raised up against the knowledge of God, and we are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. Now do you understand, when you hear these verses quoted, what the context of this was all about? This is an amazingly bold challenge to the enemies of truth. In effect, Paul was saying, this is what Paul was saying. He says, you want to go to war with me? You want to throw down? Is that what you want to do? But let me warn you, when you look at me, all you see is a mortal man. That's all you see. Short, fat, and bald. That's all you see, because you can't see. But when we go to battle, I won't be using human weapons. I won't fight on your level. I won't use conventional human weapons. It was war on another plane, in another sphere. This is where this war is going to, it'll be another sphere, another level, another realm is where this war is going to take place. In fact, when Paul fought, this is what he said. He said, by the word of truth, this is how he was going to fight. By the word of truth, by the power of God, by the armor of righteousness on the right and on the left. Isn't that what he said? Turn your Bibles to 2 Corinthians and look at this. In 2 Corinthians, and I want you to just go back, okay? And I want you to see this in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 7. Because I don't want you to think that I'm making this up. Look at it. Look what he says here. Now, isn't that what he says? He says this. He says, in the word of truth, in the power of God, by the weapons of righteousness for the right hand and the left. That's how Paul was ready to fight this war. Once declaration of war was declared, he came out with the big guns, okay? Paul knew that the real battle was not, it was not just merely against the human false teachers who had confused the Corinthians. He understood it wasn't just them. Although he was going to direct his attack against them, he understood that very clearly. But he also understood it wasn't just them. It was nothing, in fact, it was nothing less than a full-scale war against the kingdom of darkness. Paul understood this. Paul had a great comprehension because he had spiritual discernment. And let me, that's really one of the biggest challenges that we face in the ministry today. Is that our churches, many churches, lack spiritual discernment. They're so culturally bathed, they can't see the spiritual issues behind most issues. In Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12, we know the verse. Again, it bears repeating. Familiarity tends to breed contempt. So now, let's just go back in the context of 2 Corinthians that we're studying here. Okay? In the context of a leader being courageous in the life of Paul. Now let's put to light, and now let's try to put within this framework the book of Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. Look what it says. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Now you can see in his context what Paul is speaking about. He understood there was something beyond just fighting with the false teachers and false apostles inside of the church. But he understood that his warfare was up against the kingdom of darkness. We are fighting for the preservation and the proclamation of the truth. That's the thing that you must always remember. When people come up and attack me, attack my leadership, I understand right away. It's not just about me. I got that. I've got that very clear. It's not just about me. I also understand that it is a great attack against the preservation and the proclamation of truth. I understand that. That's what's at stake here. We are fighting for the honor of Jesus Christ. We are fighting for the salvation of sinners. And we are fighting for the virtue of saints. That's why we fight what we fight and we do what we do. In fact, for every good and noble effort of Christian leaders in business or in politics or in education or in the military or any other legitimate pursuit, there is an inevitable engagement with the kingdom of darkness. In fact, this past weekend, as I was engaged in what's called a quinceañera, this is where a young lady in the Spanish-speaking cultures, she comes of age. In the American culture and our American culture, we have the sweet 16. Okay? But in the Spanish-speaking cultures, it's called a quinceañera, and she comes out into become a young lady, accepted now among the community of faith, among the adults. Now she comes in to be a participant with more responsibilities, as a young lady now, with Christian virtue and so forth and so forth. Well, I had conducted such a rite of passage ceremony this past weekend, and at the end, when we got done, and I was greeting different people, and I had a school teacher who came up to me, and I had a chance to speak with him briefly, and he said, not all of us are in the kingdom of darkness. He said, many of us are, but it's my fight, my battle is in the school where I teach. And he goes, not against the students, it's against a system that's designed to keep students in the kingdom of darkness. These were his words, and I was listening to him, and we had a chance to have a dialogue afterwards. So you have to understand that this kingdom of darkness goes beyond the church. It goes beyond the church building. You're going to find it in the military. You're going to find this in business, in politics, in education, and whatever pursuit and endeavor that you may find yourself in. Since all Christians, in whatever they do, are supposed to be engaged in the advance of Christ's kingdom, you're going to face opposition from the powers of evil. That's a fact of life. So we need to prepare our people for the war that's here. Not the war that's coming. It's already here. Paul used the language of warfare all the time. He began and ended in 1 Timothy by urging Timothy to fight the good battle. Wage the good warfare. That's what he told him. In 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 18, and it bears repeating. I'm going to take you back to that because we have forgotten that. We just have forgotten about it. We forget about it. We have to be reminded from time and time and again. In 1 Timothy chapter 1, he says in verse 18, he says, this I command and I entrust to you, this is Paul to Timothy, Timothy, my son, in accordance with the prophecies previously made concerning you, that by them you fight the good fight. And then in 1 Timothy 6:12, this is how he begins the first book of Timothy. Now let me show you how he ends the first book of Timothy. In 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 12, he says this, fight the good fight of faith. Take hold of the eternal life to which you were called, and you made the good confession in the presence of many witnesses. Fight the good fight. That's why leaders are required to be courageous. And then he said in 1 Thessalonians, when he was speaking to the Macedonian churches in Thessalonica, and Thessalonica is in the Macedonia area of the northern part of Greece. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 8, he says, but since we are, he says, since we are of all the day, he says, let us be sober, having put on the breastplate of faith and love, and as a helmet, the hope of salvation. Fight the good fight. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, he continues and he says this in verse 3, 2 Timothy chapter 2, 3. He says, suffer, endure hardship with me as a good soldier of Christ. We're going to suffer. That's a reality. As Paul himself neared the end of his own life, when Paul was now coming to the end of his walk on this earth, Paul said this in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 7. He said, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith. My prayer is that you can say that. It is my desire that when I come to the end of days, that if anybody puts up a tombstone for me, those words be there. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I kept the faith. His whole life was a spiritual war. Paul's entire life was a spiritual war against and everything that opposed what? Him? No. Everything that opposed the truth. That's what was key into all of this. You cannot fight on that level with human weapons. You're not going to last long. Carnal tools have no power whatsoever against the kingdom of darkness. There is no power. The most powerful human arsenal is totally, completely impotent against principalities and powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, or against spiritual wickedness in the heavenlies. I don't care how big your military is, you're dead meat. Fleshly instruments cannot fight on that level. Human weapons have no power at all against Satan. They cannot sanctify saints. They have no effect in the spiritual realm or in the kingdom of darkness. Absolutely none. So what did Paul mean by cardinal weapons when he uses that phrase, cardinal weapons? Obviously, he would include every instrument used in literal human warfare. Paul wasn't literally planning an incursion with swords and chariots into the camp of the enemy. That's not what he was planning. He wasn't actually thinking of using physical force in Corinth. He understood what the war was about. But a moment's reflection will reveal that every type of worldly device and human invention that has ever been brought into battle against the powers of darkness is also merely a different kind of fleshly weapon. That's it. That would include human philosophy. That would include rationalistic arguments. That would include cardinal strategy. That would include fleshly ingenuity. That's going to include human cleverness. That's going to include human entertainment. That's going to include human showmanship. And we have all kinds of stuff like this. Such strategies are in full fashion these days on the platforms and the pulpits of many churches around the world. But all of them are impotent weapons. They represent vain attempts to fight spiritual battles on a human level. That's all they represent. You can use such gimmicks as sell soup and cars and Chevrolets if all you want. You can employ them in political campaigns or for public relation purposes, and we just seen that. We're ending almost a 2-year election cycle where we just seen all of this nonsense take place. But in spiritual warfare, they are utterly useless. They're like plastic pop guns with a ping pong balls. Let me tell you something. It's not going to work. They can never be truly effective against the fortresses of the evil one. Never. Even if your job is to sell cars or food products, if you are a Christian, you are a soldier in the spiritual battle, and for that battle, you need to be skilled in the use of the right weapons. That's why we train pastors. That's why we train leaders in the church. Look, God not only chooses, Jesus Christ did not only choose, but he empowered and he trained. All three of those things were always true about Jesus Christ's ministry. He would choose, he would empower, and he would train them. Who were you to walk around and making the statement, you don't need any training? You are so spiritually endowed that you require nothing. In fact, you are God's gift to the ministry. Paul said that the weapons he took to battle were mighty in God. Look, I like the King James version of it. It says it this way. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10, I like it the way it says in King James. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4, it says, "For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God, and for the pulling down of the strongholds." I like that, right? It just kind of has a better ring to it for me, right? "For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses." He was saying that these were weapons that came from heaven, from God's own personal arsenal, if you will. He certainly was not talking about gimmicks and novelties designed to make his message much more marketable. That's not what he was talking about. What Paul had in mind were clearly not weapons of human invention, but divinely ordained, spiritually powerful weapons. That's what he was talking about. Why? Because the enemy is formidable, and frankly, gimmicks and human cleverness won't do what needs to be done. We need divinely powerful weapons for the pulling down of the strongholds. That's what we need. The spiritual fortresses Paul was describing are impervious. They are absolutely impervious to fleshly weapons. They don't work. The Corinthians would have had a very, very clear picture in their minds when Paul mentioned strongholds or the destructions of fortresses. They had a very clear picture about what Paul was talking about. See, Paul spoke in a language that his audience understood. It's our responsibility for those of us who stand in the pulpit and we expound on the Word of God to explain what the intent was and what Paul was saying or what any other writer of the Bible is saying. That's what our responsibility is, because we don't live in those times now. We're disconnected. We have a long distance of time. There's this big time barrier that's between us and then. And so the Corinthians would have clearly understood what Paul was talking about. Look, just south of the city of Corinth, there was this towering, it was a massive towering over it of this mountain. There was this mountain over the city of Corinth, if you look at it, okay? And it was a natural tower of rock, is what it was. And more than 1,800 feet high, and it was known as the Acrocorinthus. And this is just this massive, massive mountain that towered over the city. And on top of this thing, it's huge, it's absolutely huge. Mm-hmm. On top of it stood an impregnable fortress. On top of this, mm-hmm, flanked by the temple of Aphrodite. Okay, of Aphrodite and right next to it, and it flanked it was this temple. Okay, now from that elevated citadel, the Acropolis of the Athens was visible for more than 45 miles. So in Corinth, they can see when the enemy was coming. They can clearly see it. And they were well defended. In fact, the fortress on top of the Acrocorinthus was where the entire population of Corinth, they would retreat in case of an attack. So if an attack came and they could see it from far away, they could move all of the citizenry of Corinth up into this mountain fortress. And that's where they would go. And from there, they could easily defend themselves. It was quite easy. They knew the strategic value of that fortress. They understood the strategic value of it. It was massive, high bulwark that could not easily be overthrown. In fact, it still towers over the ruins of Corinth today. You can still see it if you go there. Paul said that the spiritual strongholds of the powers of darkness are similar to that, except that they are spiritual and supernatural. So when Paul spoke in this language, they got it. They understood it. Such fortifications obviously cannot be assaulted with worldly weapons. Those that are spiritual and supernatural. Notice also that Paul's strategy was not merely to lob a few shots at the fortresses, but to demolish them. That was the clear intent. The expression pulling down strongholds speaks of utterly bringing them to ruin, causing them to crumble and to disintegrate. So, the question is, what are these fortresses? What are these fortresses? What actually was Paul attacking? What was he actually attacking? He gave the answer very clearly in verse 5. In 2 Corinthians 10:5, he said, casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. In the King James Version, it says, casting down imaginations, right? And every high thing that exalted itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. We are destroying speculations. This is what Paul was talking about. In fact, in the New American Standard Bible, it speaks about destroying speculations, and the King James Version says casting down imaginations. This is exactly why we go to warfare in the church, because these speculations, these imaginations get stirred up inside the church by false believers, false teachers. And all of us have to confront that reality somewhere along the line. Every single one of us are going to have to confront that reality, and you must be prepared. You must be prepared to go to war, to go to battle, just like 2 Corinthians 10:5 tells us. He says this very clearly. He says, for we are destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against what? The knowledge of God, not the knowledge of the preacher. The knowledge of God. And we are taking every thought captive to the obedience of God. Listen. That cannot happen if you don't teach and preach the full counsel of the Word of God. You must always remember that when you end a message, the speculations and the imaginations and the opinions immediately go to work against whatever you just finished teaching.